Louis Vuitton wasn't supposed to become a handbag company. It became famous for building travel trunks. So why did that change? What happened that turned a trunk maker into the creator of some of the most iconic handbags in history? The answer wasn't fashion, it was travel. Welcome to Nolvere, where every icon has a story. In the previous episode, we saw how Louis Vuitton transformed travel with one simple idea. By replacing rounded trunks with flat-top designs, he created luggage that could be stacked efficiently on trains and steamships. For decades, those trunks became the foundation of the house. But then the world began to move faster. Rail travel expanded, cars offered greater freedom, and aviation began to change the meaning of distance. Suddenly, not every journey required a large wooden trunk. The very object that had made Louis Vuitton famous was no longer practical for every kind of travel. So the house faced a new challenge. How could it preserve the durability, craftsmanship, and thoughtful design of its trunks without asking travelers to carry one everywhere? The answer was to transform that same philosophy into something softer, lighter, and entirely new. In 1930s, Louis Vuitton introduced its answer, a new travel bag first known as Tiantu, before later becoming the Keepall. The new name said almost everything, a bag designed to carry everything needed for a short journey. But what made it important wasn't its size. It was the first real attempt to bring Louis Vuitton's trunk-making expertise into a softer form. Its long silhouette, strong leather handles, and spacious interior still reflected the brand's travel heritage. But unlike the monogram versions we know today, the earliest Keepalls were crafted in canvas and leather. What disappeared was the heavy wooden structure. The bag was lighter, more flexible, and far easier to carry. Louis Vuitton hadn't abandoned what it had learned from building trunks. It had simply adapted those ideas for a different kind of traveler. For shorter journeys, it was exactly what many people needed. But it still belonged to the world of travel, and that raised another question. What if the same philosophy could exist in something even smaller? Not a travel bag, but something people could carry every single day. But the Keepall only solved part of the problem. It was perfect for short trips. The question was, what came next? What if the same philosophy could live in something even smaller? Still in the 1930s, Gaston Louis Vuitton developed the idea further. At first, it was called the Express. The name wasn't accidental. Speed had become one of the defining ideas of the modern world. People were moving faster, traveling more often, and carrying less. The new design kept the practicality of the Keepall, but in a more compact form. It was lighter, easier to carry, and better suited to a changing way of life. Eventually, it was renamed Speedy. But making a bag smaller doesn't automatically make it iconic. It still needed to evolve. In 1959, Louis Vuitton introduced a softer version in its now famous monogram canvas. For the first time, the pattern that had once protected the identity of the house's travel trunks was wrapped around something far more personal. Not a trunk waiting in a train compartment, but a bag carried by hand. The house hadn't abandoned its past. It had simply brought it closer to everyday life. Even then, one final piece was still missing. Sometimes, great design needs the right person to give it a place in history. In the 1960s, Audrey Hepburn was photographed carrying the bag on numerous occasions. According to Vogue, Her request for a smaller version became closely associated with what we now know as the Speedy 25. The change was only a few centimeters, but it changed everything. That compact silhouette suddenly felt just as natural on city streets as it did in a train station. Travel hadn't disappeared. It had simply become part of everyday life. And that's what made this design different. It wasn't born in the fashion world. It arrived there from the world of travel. But not every iconic Louis Vuitton bag was born from the changing nature of travel. Sometimes. It all started with one surprisingly specific request. How do you carry 5 bottles of champagne without breaking them? In 1932, a champagne producer brought exactly that challenge to Gaston Louis Vuitton. The result was a tall leather bag with a wide base and a simple drawstring closure. Today, we know it as the Noé. Every part of its design served a purpose. 4 bottles fit around the perimeter. A 5th stood securely in the center. Nothing about it was decorative. But then something unexpected happened. Once the bottles came out, the design proved just as useful for everyday life. Its spacious interior, comfortable shoulder strap, and effortless opening made it far more versatile than anyone had intended. What began as a solution for carrying champagne gradually became one of fashion's most recognizable silhouettes. Today, we simply call it the bucket bag, and in many ways, it reveals something essential about Louis Vuitton. The goal was never to create an icon, it was to solve a problem. The icon came later. The Keepall was created for shorter journeys. The Speedy brought that idea into everyday life, and the Noé began with one unusually specific problem. How do you carry 5 bottles of champagne? None of them were created simply to become fashion icons. They were solutions to changing needs. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of the Louis Vuitton story. Before these objects became symbols of luxury, they had a job to do. Today, we remember the icons, but it was the problem that came first. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to Nolvere, and join us as we uncover the stories behind the world's most iconic objects. Thank you for watching. Until the next story.